Okay, so history, Tuesday, March 24th. We're going to continue with Pilgrims. And so the big question is, why are we studying history? And that is because God has directed that written records be kept. And we're reading the written records that have been kept. Jeremiah 30 verse 2 says, God speaking to Jeremiah, thus speaks the Lord God of Israel, saying, write in a book for yourself all the words that I have spoken to you. And so our Bible is an example of writings that God breathed into someone for them to write down. And so that is our example, that we are to keep our history and write it down for others to read at a later time. And we continue to learn from our past and from our history. So we're going to do this card, and you should have the card, or a copy of the card, in your packet that I gave you. I'm going to read it out loud to you today, and you'll read it with me, so you need to make sure you have it. You can pause the video if you need to and go grab it. And then after I read it out to you, you're going to read it yourself and highlight it, just like we always have, just like normal. I'm not going to have you do the questions for this because we've already studied a lot of this from our readings at Christmas. We will then go on to the next one, next card, and do the questions and test on that. Okay, but we're going to kind of skip over this one. We will read it though, because we need to know it. We need to know it as part of our song. So that reminds me, you do need to be listening to your timeline history song. All right, so the back of it says, the Mayflower lands at Plymouth, and this is in year 1620. The Mayflower sailed in 1620 with 102 pilgrims on board. Of the pilgrims, 35 were separatists, means they separated from the Church of England, who believed that they should separate from the Church of England and have been living in Holland. They had moved to Holland from Scribby, England, where they had been persecuted. Originally, the Speedwell, a smaller ship, was to accompany the Mayflower on its journey. The Speedwell had been overmasted, however, and being declared unseaworthy, it was left behind. The sailors on board the Mayflower were a crass lot and did not treat the pilgrims well. During the voyage, young John Howland was swept overboard in the midst of a violent gale. His hand providentially laid hold of a rope trailing behind the ship, and he was rescued. In December 1620, the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. After spending 5 weeks in Provincetown, the Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 of the 44 men. Captain Miles Standish led an expedition that resulted in the discovery of their settlement site, Plymouth Plantation. So that's the back of your card. So when you get finished with the video, you reread it yourself and highlight important facts to kind of help you remember the story. And then I also have Story of the World, and I'm going to read pages 63 through 64. I like Story of the World because it gives facts, but kind of in a storytelling way. The Mayflower sailed from England in 1620. Good review. William and Dorothy were aboard, but they left little John in Holland, where he would be safe. They knew that the new colony would be a perilous place to live. After many cold, miserable days at sea, the Mayflower sighted land ahead. The Pilgrims had arrived at their new home, but before leaving the ship, the Pilgrims sat down together and drew up a set of laws for their new colony. They wanted to be sure that both strangers and saints would follow the same rules. This Mayflower Compact said that all colonists must agree together before a law could be passed, and that once laws were passed, each colonist would obey with all due submission and obedience. Almost every man on the Mayflower signed this compact, and then, together, the saints and the strangers elected a separatist, John Carver, to be their governor. At first, the women and children stayed on the Mayflower while Bradford and others went out exploring. Finally, the explorers found the perfect place for the new colony. Cornfields were already planted there. A freshwater stream flowed nearby. They even found the remains of a few houses made of saplings bent into arches and thrust into the ground and then covered with thick mats made of reeds. It was an Indian village, deserted several years before. They returned to the Mayflower, shouting out the news of that great find, but the women who came running to meet them were weeping, while the men were exploring, Dorothy Bradford had fallen overboard and drowned. William Bradford had little time for grief. Winter was coming, and the Pilgrims had to build log houses for their families. The work was hard and slow. The food they had brought with them from England, dried biscuits, beans, pork, soaked in salt water, began to run out. They began to die from fever, scurvy, and starvation. Sometimes 2 or 3 died in one day. William Bradford wrote of these times. But then the Native Americans who lived nearby took pity on these newcomers. Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag tribe, was willing to be friendly. One of his warriors, Squanto, could speak English, so Squanto helped Massasoit and the Englishmen make a treaty, in which they were swore not to hurt each other. Squanto himself showed the Pilgrims how to grow crops in their new fields. William Bradford wrote he showed them how to set the corn in the ground and how to tend it with it when it came up. Also, he told them if they did not put a fish in the ground with the seed for fertilizer in these long-used fields, it would come to nothing. Starvation was averted, but the young colony, which the English named Plymouth Plantation, was still a risky place to live. One hot day, Governor John Carver was laboring in the cornfields when his head began to hurt. When he came in, he lay down to rest and soon slipped into unconsciousness. Only a few days later, John Carver died. The colonists elected William Bradford to be their new leader. Bradford worked hard to make the colony successful. He planted crops, bought food from the English fishing boats that sailed by, and treated the Native Americans with friendship. By the fall of Bradford's first year as governor, the colony finally was beginning to prosper. Their crops, watched over by Squanto, had grown well and the harvest was plentiful. The Pilgrims built fires, cooked a huge feast of corn, wild turkey, fish, and deer, and invited Massasoit and 90 other Wampanoag Indians to be their guests. At this first Thanksgiving feast, the Pilgrims gave thanks to God for their survival. Soon, more Puritans would come to the New World, seeking the freedom to worship God in their own way. North of Plymouth Plantation, over 2,000 Puritans formed a second Puritan settlement called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Today, Plymouth Plantation and the Massachusetts Bay Colony are both part of the states of Massachusetts. And remember, you're learning where Massachusetts is. And remember, we had Jamestown was founded in Virginia. And so you can also find that on your map. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to do for this card. Make sure you're listening to your History Timeline song and highlight this worksheet. It just helps you to go over it and to highlight it and like, oh yeah, that's important. Okay, and so my question is to you: how many Pilgrims were on board when the Mayflower sailed in 1620? Tick tock, tick tock. 102. See you tomorrow.